Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the Internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more. Today we have a representative of a hugely important and positive phenomenon that's going on in our world today of music and general and jazz in particular, and that is education on the internet about music. And I think we're in a kind of a golden age of this, and I want to give a little historical perspective on that in a second. But first I want to tell you how I found our guest. I was telling people that I'm actively teaching myself how to play the piano these days, and I threw out a bunch of names to friends of mine, and they said, good, but make sure you check out Jeff Schneider's channel. So I did, and I'm still working on those 3s and 7s, and it's really a great thing. So welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Ken. So happy to be here. And so happy to hear that someone was recommending my videos to you. I'm happy to have that referral.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And you have, according to this document I have in my hand, 240,000 YouTube subscribers.
Yeah, it's getting up there. It's been a 7-year journey, but it's pretty amazing to be able to communicate with that many people over something as niche as jazz education.
It is amazing. I mean, who would have ever thought that was even possible? I mean, this whole thing of transmitting video via the internet for free is mind-boggling. Before Jeff and I started the recording, I was talking with him a little about some of my internet background, and I remember going to a pitch in it was either 93 or 90 or probably 93, and it was a company, and all their business was going to be was transmitting dailies. Now, if you shoot movies or you shoot TV commercials, you want the producers to see the dailies. What did you shoot that day? And what if the producers in Europe and the guys are shooting in LA? They got to put it in a FedEx box and send it across the globe. And so all that this company was going to do was make dailies available within 24 hours by using this unbelievably convoluted, difficult, multi-hour transmission process, And now here we are where anybody can just upload a video and build an audience. Hey, before we talk about your YouTube work, you are a composer. I see that you've won the Downbeat magazine composer award 3 times.
Well, I think that you might actually be looking at the ASCAP Jazz Composers Award. That I think that's what it was. There's also a Downbeat Award somewhere in that bio somewhere. But yeah, when I was kind of earning my stripes, I guess, I definitely tried to apply for some of these competitions and to challenge myself and make some more connections and, build up some sort of a reputation of some sort. But I did do a lot of composing. It started with just messing around on the piano and really playing what I heard in my head, and then I started learning more music theory and got more involved with my own education. And that went all the way to me writing full-on jazz orchestral pieces, jazz big band, and then I was able to use all of those skills actually to write music for film and TV and commercials, all that sort of stuff. So all that jazz background has really opened up a lot of other musical doors for myself.
Yeah, so you've written music for NASA, for BET, for CNN, for Google, for Ferrari. And before we get to your history, let me just ask this basic question. Here it is, 2021, and we hear, and I believe it's accurate, that it's more difficult than ever to be a working musician, or especially a performer. A lot of things are being replaced by electronics. How about being a composer? What's it like being a composer in 2021?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting. Like you have to be certainly more savvy on like the business end of things. Like I think, even in the 90s for professional performers, there were enough gigs to go around where you could kind of just ride on word of mouth and, just getting called for the gig. But as time has gone by, because there are fewer jobs of that sort, it has become a lot more important to sort of work on the business end of things. But in regards to composing, yeah, there's certainly a lot more sampled music out there. There's a lot of libraries out there that just have thousands and thousands of tracks that people, like video editors, will pull from, and you can license these tracks, and that means that there are opportunities for composers to write for these libraries, but at a certain point the libraries just become so saturated that it's hard to make your place in them. And most of the work that I've done for composing for that type of commercial work has been what's called the work for hire, which is basically just coming up with a custom piece for a specific video or advertisement or film. And yeah, I mean, it's possible. It takes I do it less just because the amount of I ended up doing more of the business side than the actual composing side. So I was just constantly hustling, trying to get the next job. And when I had the actual jobs, it was great. It was a lot of fun. They paid well, and I was getting to make music. But yeah, I ended up doing just more of. It was more trouble just to get the next gig. So I do less of that these days, unless I'm asked specifically to do a particular project. But it certainly is. It is challenging. Yeah, I think it's gotten just as hard for composers.
This is probably what photographers are going through too, as well. It's someone, you can just sit in front of your computer, click a few buttons, and get all the stock footage in the world. And yet, some photographers are able to make a living. But yeah, they've got to be business savvy, and they've got to really hustle the business side pretty hard to bring it home. How did you get started as a professional musician? What made you think, hey, I could actually do this for a living? And then what steps did you take? Did you come from a musical home? Did you go to a conservatory?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very musical home. My family wasn't into jazz. That was sort of something I discovered on my own. But my dad taught me how to play piano by ear, and both of my parents were classically trained pianists. And so I think by learning to play by ear rather than taking the traditional piano lesson route where you learn to read music and play a lot of classical repertoire, I just was trying to learn how to play like movie themes. We would watch a movie and I try to figure out how to play it on the piano. And what I think that did was it made me sort of thirsty for more advanced harmony. So when I started coming across some jazz music when I was in like band class, like in middle school, I heard a couple of these chords in jazz band, and I was like, what is that? So that drove me to want to learn more and more and more. And so once I got to high school, that's when I really got bit by the bug, and I was playing saxophone then and just started practicing all the time. And it probably by my sophomore year in high school, I was like, this is what I have to do. I mean, I was spending all of my time doing it. And I was reading these stories about guys like Charlie Parker and Coltrane and Stan Getz practicing like 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And that wasn't totally practical for me because I was still in high school. But during my summers, that's what I was trying to do, just because, I mean, that's sort of like the lore of what's necessary to become great jazz. And, it's not, to a certain extent that's true, but I think it's a little bit exaggerated. But still, I was putting in an enormous amount of time, and that helped me develop my skill set. And so, yeah, I then transitioned out of high school into a conservatory and went to New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, did jazz performance there, and then got a graduate degree in composition. So that's sort of like the education side of things. And yeah, I forgot what the other part of that question.
Oh, no, you're right on track. A couple of things came up there that are really interesting. First, it might be, we have listeners of all ages. I know we have kids in middle school who just happen to love jazz and discovered us, and then we have people in their 90s. We may even have somebody in over 100. I haven't met that person yet, but I've definitely gotten email from people in their 90s. So we've got a really broad spectrum generationally. So to help people place you in the generational spectrum, what year were you born?
So I was born in 1987, and
okay.
When I was, and I was thinking back as I was talking about my journey there, and thinking about when I was in high school, there wasn't really, I don't even know if YouTube was, I guess YouTube was just getting started then, but there certainly YouTube
YouTube was 2005.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, YouTube was maybe around during my senior year, but I doubt there were that many jazz videos there or music videos. So it was really a process of grabbing as many books as I could find, but honestly, I would owe a lot of my development at that age to working with a really good private teacher. I was studying with this saxophonist, Will Vinson, and I was fortunate enough to grow up close to New York City. So we had, at our high school, we had musicians come out from New York City who were professional jazz musicians, and really good ones at that. And that's how I had that access to that jazz education. And had I not been able to work with somebody as good as Will, then I would have probably not made the same amount of development or progress. So I owe a lot to him, and just being in the right place at the right time, because nowadays it's a lot easier to get the information, obviously, with the internet and YouTube and everything that's there.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I think jazz really, until pretty recently, was a person-to-person transmission art. In other words, you had to know somebody, or you had to be embedded in a scene. Otherwise, there really aren't books. And it's kind of, books help, but you can't really learn it entirely from a book. And having somebody that really knows the art and can lead you along and understands the development of the art. And that's something I want to say right now that I'm investing some time in learning what this is all about. This is some complicated stuff. I mean, this is, I've dealt with people in all kinds of professions. I used to do marketing for people that manufacture advanced surgical tools, so I used to have to work with surgeons and understand how surgery was performed and all this kind of stuff. How they say it's not brain surgery? I would say being a capable improvising musician on any instrument, but piano in particular, because you've got so many other elements to deal with, it's kind of up in the brain surgery category. And it's pretty involved but it's fun, and I'm just amazed at what somebody has to be able to learn and do to do this well. It's not a weekend seminar, for example. It's really
no,
I mean, it is some deep stuff, and I would encourage everybody who has even the faintest glimmer of trying to learn something practical about music to do it, because every little bit you learn just makes the music that you go out and see and hear all that more amazing, because you realize what's behind it. Another thing you're talking about is practice. The legendary 12-hour practice sessions, which may be legendary, maybe apocryphal. I don't know if they really happen. I don't know if can anyone really play a saxophone for 12 hours without destroying their lip.
Well, yeah, I definitely had a few bloody reeds in there.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, if you play enough piano, you're you got to be careful with your hands. You can kind of sprain a finger. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but I've noticed that you got to kind of be careful with what you're doing because you could kind of hurt your hand. But the thing I want to say more about the hours of practice, what impresses me is how smart you need to be about your practice. You know, in other words, it's not just a matter of, hey, I'm just going to sit there for 8 hours and grind it out and something good's going to come out the other end. You have to be like very strategic and thoughtful, and you almost have to be like a general planning an invasion of Normandy. You know, there's like all these things you've got to master, and you've got to, you know, you can't just be good at one thing. You can't say, well, I know the B flat scale really well, you know. Well, that's not going to get you anywhere, you know. And you go, well, I know some major triads, you know. Well, you got to know all 12, and you have to know like all these other variations of the triad, and then you have to know how to fuse them together, how to sequence one after another in trance. I mean, it's kind of rocket science. I'm so impressed. So for people that are getting started, also something that you said very important, you learn to play by ear. You didn't start out by learning how to read. And let's talk about that a little bit, because I think people think learning to play by ear is this magical thing and learning to read is the best way to start. And I have a feeling it might be better to learn to play by ear and then learn to read later. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, I think it actually ties right into what you were saying about how there's so much information and how it's it does have this sort of rocket science feel to it. Another analogy that I use all the time in my teaching is that it's a language. It's learning to speak a language, but with your instrument. So there's vocabulary, there's grammatical rules, and there's so many language parallels. And another parallel that is very related to what we're talking about now is how we learn to speak. We don't learn to read first. We learn by imitating. We learn with our ears. It's a much more organic experience than seeing words on a page and trying to figure out what they mean. It's all an oral experience. And I think that especially adults have a tough time sort of letting go of that need to want to get it right away. And so, you can kind of like maybe force it a little bit more if you have like very concrete sheet music in front of you. And it's just a little bit more of an abstract process to learn something by ear and to learn it through imitation. And it's something that's more easily done when you're younger. That doesn't mean you can't do it when you're older, but it's just like whenever you learn a language. Like you can learn how to speak Spanish or Japanese when you're older. It's just, it takes some time, and it takes longer than it would take if you were 2. So I think just keeping in mind that language parallel is really, really helpful. And you wouldn't expect yourself to learn how to speak French fluently in even 6 months. Like you would need to spend a lot of time studying and practicing. And one more language parallel that ties into what we're talking about here is, there is this sort of these legendary hours of practicing that we hear about with guys like Charlie Parker and Coltrane and everybody. And really what they're doing when anybody practices for a really, really long period of time, it's very similar to moving to a country in order to learn the language. Like that works because you're enveloped in that language when you're living in a country. And if you're practicing all the time and you're always playing, you're always at jam sessions and you're always studying and taking lessons, then you're essentially moving to the country of jazz, if we want to continue the analogy there. It's very much the same way in how you would learn a language.
Gotcha, like total immersion.
Exactly, complete immersion.
Wow. There's another element of language, too, that I've been thinking about, which is, well, first of all, about this reading business is there are, until the Middle Ages, and maybe there were other cultures previous to that had music notation, but music notation was an invention. It was an innovation. It was something that came later. There was a whole lot of music going on in the world without it being written down, as there was a whole lot of speaking going on. Not every language has. Well, and I guess now every language has an alphabet of some kind. But there were plenty of languages that were never. There was nothing to read. It was all oral culture.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then imagine, if you're a small child and your parents, instead of talking with you and working with you on individual words and said, well, here's a book, read this thing, and come back to us when you understand how to speak English. That would be ludicrous. The other kind of parallel that I notice is I'll learn something in theory, and then I'll just sit at the piano and just fool around with it for hours. I'm just so fascinated. Like, oh, look at this. Like that thing that you had. The thing that brought us together was Jeff's talking about. Is it called a frame? No, when you play the tonic, the main note, and then in the right hand you play the third and the seven. What's that?
Oh, like a shell voicing.
Shelf voicing. So I mean, I'm so fascinated by that. I'm just like just endlessly fooling around, and I'm not really playing tunes, and I'm not strictly practicing. I'm not like sitting down and going, okay, now you must do this and you must do that. I realize what I'm doing in that moment is I'm more like a baby babbling, and in other words, I've heard some sounds, somebody's given me some direction, and now I'm just sort of trying out the apparatus, sort of free-form, unstructured, without a plan. And in the process of it, I'm learning my thirds and my sevenths, and they're becoming automatic. And so I think, what do you think about that? That in addition to doing your formal, serious practice, you should budget time for just taking it as something that you've learned and just screwing around with it endlessly and seeing what you can do with it.
Absolutely, and I think part of what goes into that is just sort of like the psychology of practicing and motivation. Like if you're always working on exercises that are extremely methodical and require so much discipline, like that type of practicing can be really effective, but it's not always practical in terms of, like we were talking about practicing for 12 hours a day. Like no one can sustain that amount of concentration and discipline. So you need to work in time where you're just exploring and trying things out and frankly having fun with it. That said, there's definitely a time and a place for really disciplined, methodical practicing, and oftentimes that's when you make the most progress because it's like doing a workout. You're flexing a specific muscle and you're working it out specifically. You're isolating it, and just like with a workout, it's not always fun, and sometimes you need to kind of go through that grind in order to come out the other end with a really strong skill set. But like you said, you have to budget time in there and balance it with just a more enjoyable experience. And one of the ways that I do that for myself is I think about these two different, we talk about practicing and playing, and I try to differentiate those two experiences. Like when I think about practicing, it's very deliberate, it's very intentional, using specific exercises, working on what I need to work on in order to get to the next level, and then adding into that experience some play and balancing the two. And then one other thing that I like to remind myself and to tell my students is that all of that very deliberate practice, the stuff that does sometimes feel a little bit like a grind, if you can get through that, then the playing part of it becomes a lot more fun because you are able to use those hard skills in all of these different situations. And, especially with jazz where so much of it is improvised. I mean, it's like trying to, learn that brain surgery and then come up with your own techniques on the spot and create your own, I don't know enough about brain surgery to continue that analogy, but it's really something else to be using that complex information and reconfiguring it spontaneously to create something new. It's kind of insane when you think about it. And in order to get to that point, I think you really, unless you're sort of abnormally talented and are, to a certain extent, I think there are people who are born with some of those talents or develop them at an early enough age that it seems like it comes naturally, and we can talk more about that at some point if you want. But I think that the bottom line is just to balance the two. Make sure you're practicing deliberately, but also don't burn yourself out and have some fun with it, whether it's in the practice room or on the bandstand.
I heard George Benson say something really interesting about practice. He said, well, if I practice 10 things, I'll probably have 2 of them available to me on the gig. In other words, it's sort of like you're throwing stuff into a pot, and you don't know exactly when it's going to be useful and when it's going to come out. And that was really interesting to me to hear George Benson say that. It's like, really, you practice stuff that you never get to use, or you use very rarely. So he said, well, so my strategy became I practice 100 things, so I'll have 10 of them available when I do the gig. So does that ring true? Like the idea that you're putting things in this pot that you're constantly stirring, and you don't know exactly what is going to come out the other end when it's time for the performance
that's
your
absolutely
improvisation.
True. Yeah, and part of that just has to do with the fact when you're playing with other people, you're going to be getting information in that, or let's say we're using the pot analogy here. Other people are going to bring their own ingredients to the experience. So that's going to influence what you come up with. So if I play in a blues band versus like a straight ahead jazz band, I'm going to come up with different ideas just because of the context of the music. But also, what do I want to say about that? So you have these various contexts, and I totally lost my train of thought there.
But I think possibly where you're going, and it was a question that I had, is not only, and this is for fans and who aren't musicians yet. Not only do you have your private practice time where you're working things out, then you take your skills and meld them with other musicians. And when musicians come together, it's almost like a whole nother organism gets created. Like this, you know what I mean? Things get pulled out of the ozone when, especially when people have been playing together for a long time, and
Exactly.
they just sort of get this feel. So much of what it really is magic. There's this very technical side where you got to learn your P's and Q's and learn your chord changes and all this stuff. But then when you're individually improvising, or or just the influence that another group of musicians has on you somehow pushes creativity that you don't. Creativity is a funny thing. You've got to do all the homework, but when it comes, it's kind of not clear exactly where it's coming from. If you know what I mean. It's not rational.
Absolutely.
It's not like you've got this stack of ideas and you're going to dole them out very methodically and very rationally during a solo. That doesn't quite work that way,
For sure. Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes from your subconscious and then the subconscious of others. The other people that you're playing with. And the best bands that I've ever heard, like you say, it's like they move as one. You might have 5 people in a band, but if they're familiar with each other's playing, they kind of intuitively know where one's going to go, and they can follow them there, and they have enough experience playing with each other that they can go in completely uncharted territory. Like if you listen to the old Miles Davis quintet recordings, they went in all different kinds of directions, because they had played together so much. And, one thing that is maybe, a little bit of a disadvantage these days is you have fewer bands, especially in jazz. Like, you have a gig and then you hire some musicians for the gig, and maybe you play with some of the same musicians sometimes, but rarely do you have a single group of musicians that's playing together for years and years. And, one example I guess I can think of is, like the Wayne Shorter Quartet. Those guys played together for a really, really, really long time, and I guess they still do. But you have fewer and fewer bands that stick together for a long period of time and have that sort of unity and that ability to explore so seamlessly. But then again, you can put 5 all-star musicians together, and even if they've never played with one another, they have enough experience on their own and ability to be fluent with the language that they can still try some things out and truly improvise as a whole. And by the way, that thing I was going to mention before that we were talking about with working material into your playing, like with that George Benson story you told. Another story that I heard from the great Michael Brecker was that he would work on ideas for hours and hours and hours. He was another really big practicer. But then he fully admitted that a lot of the stuff that he practiced wouldn't really show up in his playing until months afterwards. And just to make that relevant to non-musicians out there, it's no different than if you're learning like a new vocabulary word and you start to, you can kind of force it into your conversation with people and it feels a little bit artificial. But then after a little bit of time, it kind of just naturally shows up. But to get to that point, it's not immediate. Like for something to show up organically in your conversation, like a new vocabulary word, that takes some time. And I guess the science behind it is something like, converting short-term memory into long-term memory and however that works. But yeah, there is definitely a time delay in what you practice and when it actually comes out and you're playing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a bit of faith in this. Especially when you're a beginner, it's so easy to think, oh, this is insurmountable. I can't possibly do this, and you can, because just look around you. There's millions of people that have done it. So it can't be impossible, but it feels impossible for beginners. So I think one of the things beginners have to do is just put those concerns about where it's all leading and how it's all going to unfold aside, and just sort of focus on, A, having fun. And then B, learning the things you need to learn. You need to know your major scales. You need to know your triads. There's certain things you just have to know cold, just like you have to know the ABCs and you have to know the multiplication tables. And I don't know, do people need to know them, or is everybody on a calculator now? But when I was a kid, you had to memorize the multiplication tables. And there's, maybe in a weird way, music is helping humanity retain certain disciplines and mental traits that the digital world is taking away. In other words, I don't think my young nephew, is learning the multiplication tables. I think they just hand him a calculator and they're done. Now, in music, you can't get away with that. You have to learn your 12 major scales.
Yeah,
and,
definitely. You can't be relying on sheet music.
Yeah. What's really funny is everybody that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. We're doing it. We're doing this over the phone, so Jeff and I can't see each other. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and especially with jazz, where you're playing improvised music, you're not looking at sheet music, so it is very akin to mental math.
Yeah. Yeah, very much. Like those guys that can calculate, add up, 15 4-digit numbers in their head, and it seems like magic. Right. But there's a method to it, and there's a little bit of training involved.
Absolutely.
But it's funny how many educators, music educators, will say, okay, you got to learn your major scales. And I don't think, because I didn't understand that, a beginner hears that and goes, yeah, okay, whatever. And then you start trying to do stuff. You're a little bit further down the road, and you realize, wow, I don't really know what the third degree of the A sharp is. Like I can't produce that.
That's an important point, actually. Yeah.
Oh,
and when you say, and when people say learn your major scales, when I learned my major scales in whatever that was, 9th grade, I was just playing up and down my saxophone, just the notes. I wasn't even thinking about this is the third or this is the fifth. But even you just saying what's the third of the scale is a really appropriate and pertinent question for improvising, because it's not just a matter of getting the muscle memory together, but you really have to know the numbers and how the theory works with those scales. So I think that's the fact that you're asking that question, Ken, is a really good sign.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about the math of music is that it's arithmetic. It's not calculus. However, it's a lot of arithmetic that you learn to do in your head. You ultimately are learning to do it in your head on the fly, and it's such a wonderful thing. And I didn't have music education. Oh, I had piano lessons from the world's meanest piano teacher when I was an 8-year-old. It totally put me off to music, or at least it put me off to the concept that I could learn music. I somehow came away from the experience with a conclusion that I wasn't cut out for it, which is absurd. If you can speak and you can sing, you can play music. It's just a matter of learning what you need to learn. And I think that's another parallel between language and music. We think that music is this thing that you've got to be born gifted at. And I think obviously there are people who are born with tremendous gifts, just as there are people born with tremendous visual arts gifts and verbal gifts and so on, mathematical gifts. But the idea that the world is divided into musical human beings and non-musical human beings, I think, is a fallacy. I think if, every kid loves to hear their favorite nursery rhyme and their favorite songs. Everybody has music that they love. And I think the fact that you love music is an indicative that you can hear it. You can hear the structure. That's why you love it.
Yeah.
So I hope. Well, and actually, let's bring that to this. We've seen a falling off of music education in the schools. I didn't have it at all in grammar school or high school. There was no music education at all. It didn't exist in the schools I went to. And unfortunately, that's becoming more of a norm. For instance, I know New York City used to have a fantastic, every kid got an instrument or was in a choir or a chorus, and that was just the norm, and now that's gone. And that's an unfortunate trend. Therefore, I'm very encouraged by what's going on the web, and on YouTube in particular seems to be the platform for it, which is that really high quality, excellent music education at all levels, whether you're interested in jazz or folk music or Irish music or Turkish music, whatever it is, there's somebody or somebodies on there making it available to you, whether you have a live teacher or not in your community, which I think is just a fantastic thing. How did you mentioned that YouTube started to appear when you were in, did you say high school, junior high school?
Probably the beginning of college.
Beginning of college. Okay, so YouTube was just sort of making itself known. When did you start thinking, I could take some of what I've learned and share it with other people on YouTube?
Yeah, well, ever since I started really getting serious about playing music, I also really enjoyed teaching it, whether it be to like another musician or just even explaining something to my sister who really didn't care about the intricacies, but she could appreciate music and enjoyed hearing me talk about it. And I really got passionate and fired up about sharing all this kind of stuff and teaching it to other people. So around the time, I guess maybe around 2015, something around one of those years, I was actually interested in some other people's YouTube channels that weren't music related at all. Like I was getting very into photography at the time, and there were a lot of really good photography channels and people explaining things, and I learned a lot from them. And then I would, just kind of like poke around to see what would happen if I typed in some musical search terms or whatever. And there was some stuff out there, and there was some good stuff, but not a lot of great stuff. And I thought that frankly, I could do better and like put some stuff out there that would make some things really clear. Like the information that I saw that was up there, like some of these people could play they could play well, but the stuff the way they were explaining it may not have been the most clear or even accurate in terms of like the music theory behind it. So I wanted to add my voice to that conversation essentially and start making YouTube videos. And I didn't really have too much of an end game in mind. I just wanted to reach a broader audience. I was teaching a lot of private lessons at the time, and I was teaching, as many music teachers do on like a local level, teach a lot of younger kids, and I enjoyed that, but a part of me really wanted to share what I knew about more advanced concepts. So that's YouTube was my outlet for that, and I was able to really dig into more advanced concepts there beyond just, learning how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb or something like that. So that's how I got started with it, and it then started to blossom into something where I was able to grow a following and started communicating and teaching adults advanced concepts from all over the world. I was working with people literally all over the globe, and that was just amazing to me to be able to share something I was so passionate about and help other people with that were just not in my house, and I wasn't in their house. They were literally like, one of my very first students was in Bahrain, And that just blew my mind to be able to teach somebody in Bahrain how to play jazz. And I was just totally hooked on it from then on.
Did you do that via Skype, or how do you conduct your lessons?
Yeah, I did it. I started out with Skype, and I remember I slowly started switching over to Zoom, but that was even before people knew what Zoom was, so I had to kind of explain it, and now everybody knows what it is. But yeah, I started with Skype, and it's funny how the evolution of that whole education scene, how it's gone. Like when I was in college, before YouTube was really a thing, I remember, I mean, everybody had private lessons because I did go to conservatory. But I remember I studied with this one legendary teacher named Charlie Banakis, and he didn't even come to the school. Like I was in Boston, and I had to get on a train to Beverly, Massachusetts, and take like a 2-hour train ride just to get to this half-hour lesson. And people would work with Charlie via cassette tape. Like he would teach people all over the world and mail back and forth these cassette tapes. I mean, this was before you could, I mean, maybe by that time you could email audio and so forth, but he was pretty old school, and they would literally mail back and forth cassette tapes. And just to think of how that's changed now, where I'm teaching people over Zoom that are on the other side of the world, it's really mind-blowing.
Well, believe it or not, easy streaming audio didn't really become available till 2002. So it took a while, and then of course YouTube showed up not that long after. Do you remember your first YouTube video? What do you remember what it was? What the trials and tribulations of making one? The first one. I'm just curious.
Yeah, my actually prior to our call, I was just kind of digging through my old videos, and the first tutorial that I put out was a saxophone video that I think I did the video on my phone, and I uploaded it from my phone, and it was really crummy video quality. The audio was fine, but it was just like a very unsophisticated, technologically speaking, a very unsophisticated video. But that video actually did pretty well, and I kind of had a sense of, a whole part of growing on YouTube is, yes, you have to make good content, but you have to kind of know how to, there's like a little bit of marketing involved with it, like especially these days when there's so much information out there, like you have to have like the right thumbnail and the right title and everything to catch somebody's attention. And even back then I was thinking, all right, because that specific video that I'm referring to, it was this saxophone sound exercise that involves using a pencil and actually placing a pencil essentially inside the saxophone in a particular way to make it to improve your sound. And I don't even remember what the name of the video was, but it was like the pencil trick video or something like that. And it's this really cool, simple exercise that improves saxophone sound, and it was exciting to be able to share that. And that was my first video.
Wow. I wonder if you've seen this video. Somebody, I think it was a guitar teacher, and he was talking about the fact he's been teaching for decades, so he's got a pretty long experience of how things have changed. And he says, well, when I first started, kids used to show up with albums, LPs, vinyl, and say, I want to learn this song, and this song. And because of the nature of albums, there was a lot of printed material. Often you knew who all the musicians were. You knew when it was recorded, where it was recorded. You might have known the lyrics. You came with not only the music in hand, but also some understanding of the context. And then he said, well, then the next generation came with CDs, and they knew a little bit less. Have you seen that video? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I haven't seen that one, no.
Oh, it's great. It's so fantastic. So then he goes, well, then they started coming with, what was the next stage of, what was Napster? They come with Napster. And then he says, now kids show up with their phones. Oh, here was the point. Here's the real point of the story. He would always ask somebody at the beginning of the relationship, what kind of music do you like? What do you want to be able to play? Because that's, of course, that's where you really should begin with people, because people need that strong motivation to go through all the work to learn. Yeah. And if they're not playing stuff they like, what's going to happen? So he says kids in the LP era knew exactly what they wanted to learn. They knew the tune, they knew the name of it. He said they also knew obscure tunes, things that maybe weren't famous, but they had fallen in love with because they had the vinyl. And then that happened a little bit less with CDs because there's just not as much information on a CD. And then he said with the smartphones, he'd ask kids, what do you like? And they would go blank. And they'd pick up their phone and start scrolling through their phone trying to find something. And often they could finally figure out something they liked, but they weren't even necessarily aware who did it or when it was recorded, and they certainly didn't understand the context it was in. And they didn't know any of the obscure tracks, any of the, the nerd music, the stuff that you would only discover if you'd list lots and lots of tracks. And he became, as a teacher, as an educator, became very depressed until he started getting contacted from people from Bahrain and from Yugoslavia and from Bolivia or wherever, and he realized, okay, maybe the population, unfortunately, temporarily is being dumbed down musically, but there are still people who are really into it. And I, as an educator, I can reach them and work with them via the internet regardless of where they are. This is obviously a double boon. It's a boon to the educators because they've got people they can work with, but it's a boon to somebody living in, Sioux City, Iowa, who maybe will never see a conservatory. Or how about that kid?
Yeah.
Joey, that kid from Indonesia, Joey Alexander. Right. I mean, he grew up in he grew up in Bali. Like, what's the jazz scene in Bali like? It can't be that huge, right?
I don't know. But
yeah, so
I think
on the one hand,
it's sort of
yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that on that note of the access that people have these days and the amount of music that's available, I think there's definitely that benefit of getting, whether it's education or music, with YouTube you can find all kinds of information and lessons, and with listening to actual tracks, you've got just about every song ever on Apple Music or Spotify or what have you. The con to that, though, is, if you rewind 20 years ago or something, or even more than that, when people were listening to records or even CDs, but even if we just start with records, which was what you were talking about with that video, somebody has a couple of records or even an extensive record collection. They put on the record and they're hearing the same songs over and over and over again, and they're really getting to know the tracks. And yes, of course, also the musicians and the liner notes that are included there. But and then the same with CDs. Maybe you have a few CDs and you listen to them over and over and over again. But one of the cons of the way things are now is that you have so much music that it's very tempting to just listen to one thing a couple of times and then listen to something else, because it's so easy to get your hands on just about any track. And there's definitely something to be said for living with a CD or a record or even just one song for an extended period of time, which was kind of forced upon us way back when. But now it's very tempting to just listen to something else. And the same is true for the education side of things. Like for somebody learning to play music on YouTube, yes, it's amazing to have the quality of information that's out there, but you also run the risk of information overload and just being, you have that suggested feed on YouTube and you're watching one lesson, then you see, a video called something else that sounds super interesting. And so you lose that guidance that's really important, especially when learning something as complex as music. It'd be like trying to learn brain surgery by just, dropping into a fourth-year med school class and having no idea what anybody's talking about, and then trying to catch up. And really what you should be working on is something way more fundamental. But there's just not that level of guidance and really restriction when you're let loose on the internet. So, there's pros and cons to it, but I guess I have to lean towards the pros because it's helped me and it's helped me help other people. But I think it's important to keep that in mind for anybody that's studying music, to just watch out for that, I guess, shiny object syndrome or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, it's powerful. It's very easy to devolve into a guy watching videos about playing piano versus practicing. Because you could literally sit there and never leave your chair for 10 years. And you won't run out of good videos. There's so much good music instruction that you'll never run out of good stuff. But yeah, it's definitely. I think you're right. I think that is really the biggest challenges to have, and this is where at some point it probably makes sense to establish a relationship or pick one or two people. Yeah, definitely delve in and check out what everybody's doing, but go with a system that's going to take you from beginning to end, as opposed to just endlessly grazing. Because you could end up being in a maze forever, especially because of the nature of the subject. The thing about brain surgery is like the brain isn't different from one brain to another. Like once you learn the structure of the brain and you learn the various surgical techniques, you're done. I mean, there's always, you can learn a new technique here and there, but you don't learn a new technique at every gig. You don't.
Yeah.
You don't improvise a whole. You don't invent and discover a whole new way to approach a tune or surgery every week, every other day. So it actually is quite complicated, and therefore guidance does really ultimately become valuable. I wish I could remember where I got this from. But I mean, this was my life too. You would buy a record in the old days, and it wasn't like you had a lot of records. The average person didn't have a lot of records. So when you got a record, it was an event. It was a huge event. I mean, I remember. I don't know if you wouldn't know this, but I was roommates with Stanley Jordan when we were in college, the guitar player, and
oh, wow.
I remember when a new Stevie Wonder album would come out, I mean, the world would stop, and we would play that thing until we wore it out over and over and over again. And I think that's a really important part of the learning experience, is taking one piece of music and getting to know every nook and cranny of it. And that could get lost with streaming world. So there's pros and cons, but I was reading something. You probably were aware of this, but I just didn't know this history. That American music culture, part of a big element of American musical culture was vaudeville, and variety shows, and this was before movies, and obviously before recorded music even, and before radio. And so if you wanted to hear music, you'd go to these shows. There'd be a juggler, and there'd be a dog training. A dog would be jumping through hoops, and then someone would play some music, and then so on. And then there'd also be musical theater, and that in that era, in the lobby, they were selling sheet music. I mean, this is so mind-boggling to me because it was a different world, right? And there weren't like a lot of million-seller hits, but million-seller sheet music hits did exist. Like it happened, with relative frequency. So people would go to a show, they'd hear some music they loved, they'd grab the sheet music, and they'd go home and play it. And recorded music kind of knocked that out or diminished that significantly. Mm-hmm. And then probably radio initially. I guess on the one hand, radio would stimulate people to go out and hear music, but now we're in this sort of environment where we've got streaming music, and there are all these software programs. I get this ad on my YouTube feed every now and then with this guy's bragging, I wrote this song in just 2 minutes, and he pushes a button, and there's this, I guess it's music, and I guess you can grab beats, and you can grab chords, and you can even grab chord progressions and push a button, and all the chord progressions just cut and paste in, and you can do a vocal track, and literally in 2 minutes you've got supposedly have a song. So where am I going with this? For the general public, I sometimes think the public is getting shortchanged. In other words, let me say this. So, for instance, the rock and roll and the popular music of the '60s, and especially the '70s, was incredible, right? The musicianship and the things people were pulling off were unbelievable. And now you listen to popular music, and it may be, this might be an exaggeration, but it's like the same three producers in a studio just, doing rehashes of the same thing over and over again. So with that on the table, that may not be a positive direction. But on the flip side of it, for someone that wants to learn music and wants to play music and wants to get into the intricacies of it and wants to really appreciate it at a deeper level, it's probably never been easier globally for people who want to do that to do that. That was a long, because Jeff, I can remember I had a friend, or he was my teacher at Princeton. I took some music classes, and he went and taught at the New School's music department, their jazz program, and this was like 1981, and we were all like scratching our heads, like, what, you mean? I mean, we were aware of Berkeley and, of course, North Texas, but the idea that there'd be lots of academic jazz performing programs, that was like unthinkable as recently as 1980. That was like rock, that was like going to the far side of the moon, and so on the one hand, we have the greater culture. They're not teaching music in the schools. A lot of the music seems to be way super processed and way super electronic. It's streaming instead of people actually holding the music in their hand and treasuring it and listening to it over and over again. So we've got that tendency on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have people like you who are bringing information that otherwise you literally could not get unless you lived in Boston, unless you lived in New York, and you pointed out, unless you were willing to get on the train and do a 4-hour round trip to get to the guy that had it. So we're living in an interesting age, but it's a golden age, and you and your colleagues that are bringing this music to everybody are I think doing just unbelievably important work. How can people follow you? Where do they find you? Where, what's your? I assume you have a website. What's the name of your channel on YouTube?
So if you just you can just Google my name, Jeff Schneider, and Jeff Schneider Music will pop up there. But if you want to go direct to the website, it's jeffschneidermusic.com, and the YouTube channel is also called Jeff Schneider Music. And I have if you go to my website, there's a newsletter sign up there if you want to get some extra music tips, whether you're into soloing or improvising or just playing chords on the piano. I do a little bit of everything there. So that's a great way to keep in touch. And what's that?
I can see that somebody that's like a super serious student would obviously benefit from knowing your material and taking advantage of it. What if somebody's like, because we have a lot of fans that I bet they know a lot more music than they realize because they've been listening for decades, but for some reason they've never had the opportunity to sit down in front of a piano. I'm thinking piano is probably the easiest thing for somebody who's older. I know in my case it's like, you got to be an athlete to play a horn and the trumpet. I mean, that's a whole other dimension we didn't get into. The nice thing about the piano is you hit middle C and you're going to get middle C. You're not going to get some squeaking, squawking, dying duck sound, So what about somebody that's like they've never had a music lesson, they don't know a tonic from a dominant, they don't know what a B minor, chord is. Is there stuff on your site and your YouTube channel that they could benefit from?
I think a lot of the material that I come out with is geared a little bit more intermediate, but I do have, it may have been the video that we connected on, Ken. I think it's called something like the 3-note jazz piano chord, something along those lines, like 3 notes and jazz piano chords. But honestly, that might even be more advanced for people who are just starting out. I think one of the best ways to get going is, if you have an instrument, if you have like even a simple keyboard, like piano keyboard, to just try to play stuff that you hear in your head, like we were talking about earlier. Like there's so much, we're so familiar with this sort of traditional journey of starting by learning how to play Beethoven, and there's value to that, but I think it's even more valuable to just connect the sounds that you hear in your head to an instrument. And that can be as simple as singing a few notes, singing a melody and trying to figure it out on the piano and just start strengthening that connection between your ear and your instrument, because that's all playing music is. And it can be, like we were talking about with all the information that's out there, and even just being too focused on reading music or what have you, at the end of the day, it's all about building that connection between your ear and your instrument. And the sooner you can get started connecting those two, the better you're going to be at playing music, the more enjoyable it's going to be to play music, and the more enjoyable it's going to be to listen to music, just because you have a greater sense of what's going on.
Gotcha. So people can go to Jeff Schneider, and that's SCHNEIDER, music.com. You have the website and then your YouTube channel. And so if you've got a person in your life that is playing some music, they have sort of some of the fundamentals down, and they want to take it further, definitely check out Jeff's material. And I encourage, there are some channels that sort of explain fundamentals of music to people too, and people who are out there looking on YouTube will find them. I recommend take advantage of those things. It's as Jeff said, it's a language, and first you'll know how to say hello and goodbye, and you know how to say please and thank you, and it may not seem very impressive, but you've broken the ice. If you know what a chord progression is, for example, you're now way ahead of where you were if you didn't know. And so all those things, all those fundamentals are definitely learnable out there. And I guess bottom line, we are living in an absolute golden age of music education right now. It's just a wonderful, spectacular thing. And I'm glad to have a representative of that movement visiting with us on Jazz on the Tube. So Jeff Schneider, thank you so much for all you're doing and for spending the time with us today.
Thank you, Ken. It's been such a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the Internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.